Hi. So former Justice Stevens wants to ditch the Second Amendment, but is this a viable solution to gun violence or a liberal fantasy for doomed failure? Townhall.com editor Katie Pavlich joins me now. She's also a Fox News contributor. I'm also joined by a columnist at Pacific Standard Magazine, David Perry. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, Kennedy. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So, Katie, I will start with you. You know, a lot of people on the left say this isn't about taking guns away. It's not about banning guns. It's not about repealing the Second Amendment. But clearly, for some people who no longer have an active political agenda, people like John Paul Stevens, who has been on the wrong side of this issue for a long time, that's what it's really about, isn't it?
Well, first, I want to say thank you for having me on your show to exercise my First Amendment rights to defend the Second Amendment rights of millions of Americans all across the country, first of all. Second of all, to your point, yes, for a very long time, we have heard the left argue they just want common sense gun reforms. When you really look at this, and you have people like Justice Stevens coming out and saying they want a full repeal of the Second Amendment, which is virtually impossible considering you need 38 states to agree to that, and they're not going to do that considering Republicans are in charge of most of those states. However, that doesn't mean that local jurisdictions or the federal government can't limit the Second Amendment so much that the right to bear arms is essentially outlawed. And so you have to keep that in mind. But when you look at the signs that were at the march this weekend, when you look at the rhetoric of a number of people in Rolling Stone, in the New York Times, they lay out the fact that they want to confiscate millions of guns, want to turn gun owners into criminals. We had a sheriff in North Carolina just this week saying he wanted to kill gun owners. People hear that and go, you know what? I don't think so. I don't think I'm going to give the government all that power, and I'm certainly not going to give it to law enforcement officers who are openly talking about going after gun owners in a way that results in their death.
And David, now I understand there are a lot of people on the left who are going to say, like, no, this really is about what Katie said, common sense gun control. Where do you stand on this and John Paul Stevens' exhortation that we repeal the Second Amendment?
You know, I think, again, thank you for having me on. I'm glad to have this conversation. We can't just talk to ourselves in our partisan bubbles. And, you know, I think that on the right, you need to reckon with the fact that you've lost a Republican like John Paul Stevens. And here's why. Certainly
Wait,
since...
hold on! John Paul Stevens is a Republican. That's fun. Thank you, David. Thank you so much.
He was. It's worth thinking about why he's not, right? So here's the thing.
Not really. As a libertarian, it's not about that at all, my friend. Do a little research before you come on the show. This is not a show based in some partisan fantasy that you may have painted for yourself.
So here's the thing. Every time that there's one of these horrific events, the right and the left come together and start talking about reasonable reforms. Most of us mostly agree on most of the things we want to do. Not all of them, but plenty of things. But it never happens. It never happens. We never get any of these common sense reforms through.
What does that mean? Define
what's next?
Common sense.
Oh, I mean, just the kind of things you said, talking about domestic abusers, talking about universal background checks, limiting straw purchases, talking about high capacity ammunition, talking about AR-15s, those kinds of reasonable places where we can have a good debate about do we need AR-15s? That's a good thing to debate, but we never do anything. And we never do anything because any time we get close, the NRA and other really radical, very small minority people
cars that go over
stop.
80 miles per hour? Do we need cell phones?
I would love, thank you.
We could do everything with flip phones.
If we could treat cars and guns the same way, that would be fantastic.
I would love it because then we would all have insurance.
I would never mention the Second Amendment again. Because also when I get a car, if I sell you my car, you don't want my car.
But if I sold of this issue,
let's get back to someone who. You're absolutely right, Katie. Okay, David, hold on a second, David. You've been talking for quite some time, and I've allowed you your space and your points. But let's talk a little bit about. You're welcome, dear. Let's talk a little bit about a jurist, one who is supposed to hold the Constitution sacred. You cannot cherry pick for political benefit certain parts of the Constitution that you now see as outdated.
Yeah, Kennedy, I would just say,
no, David, hold on. I'm going to let Katie respond. Thank you.
I'm going to interrupt you. I'll let you respond to me once I get my point out. If you take away the Second Amendment and repeal the Second Amendment, as the justice who is supposed to be defending the Constitution instead of ripping it up claims, then you can start talking about taking away other amendments as well as a result of that, as consequences of that. For example, the Fourth Amendment, unlawful search and seizure, that would be required if we repealed the Second Amendment. The Fifth Amendment, which would be the government coming into people's homes and confiscating private property without compensation. That is also something that would have to be taken out of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, in order for them to get their Second Amendment repeal pipe dream. So if you want to repeal one of them, you're going to have to deal with the consequences of dealing with a whole bunch of other amendments and rights being taken away. And on the issue of talking about, does anybody, quote, need an AR-15? It's called a Bill of Rights. It's not called a Bill of Needs.
That's a good point,
sure.
Katie. And you know, I want you to respond, David, specifically to the idea that there are people out there who want to repeal the Second Amendment. And as I said in my opening monologue, the reason this country is so powerful and people feel safe is they have a right to defend themselves. And if you look at regimes like North Korea, people there don't have mobility. They don't have access to basic freedoms. They also cannot defend themselves because people in those countries, the people with the guns, are the people in power.
You know, all around the world, there are countries that are more and less free. Very few of them have firearms in the way that we do in the United States. I think that's a mistaken argument.
You're right. They have many more illegal firearms in places like France.
Crime is higher. Violent crime is higher in Great Britain.
But we're not talking about Great Britain or... Okay, anyway.
But you guys want that.
Think we have
You're
to
the ones who want UK-style, Australian-style confiscation and gun control. So if you're going to compare us to that, let's talk about the consequence, which is violent crime is higher in those countries than it is here in the United States.
I would like us to go back to this idea that the Bill of Rights can't be changed. We, in the Constitution, built a system to change the Bill of Rights. That was the whole point of how it was structured. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm saying it's possible right now, but here's the thing. Political cultures change. So if you don't want the political culture to change to make that possible, come with me. Join me in working on common sense, common ground solutions. We can actually do this. We can make America a safer place.